What is the absolute first rule of a journalist? If I were to ask viewers that question, what would you think the answer would be? Now, to me, the obvious answer is tell the truth. Tell the truth. I think this is an absolute prerequisite for any journalist in any publication, in any outlet, in any country. That should be the absolute prerequisite. Tell the truth. Now, I don't often do this, but I'm going to be speaking about a prominent journalist who was highly controversial. Um, but also, it has to be said, admired by many. I think, unfortunately, so because the person in question I'm very critical of, but it is a reality that he was admired by many who shared his worldview. I'm talking about John Pilger, the Australian journalist who worked for numerous publications and also worked as a freelancer. He's passed away at the age of 84 on, I believe it was New Year's Eve, actually December the 30th. So, as a source for this video, I'm using the Times obituary. There we have it. But I've long been critical of Pilger, and there were things here I didn't even know, which um, further makes me feel that this guy was a bit of a charlatan, certainly a moral hypocrite. Anyway, I'm going to talk about this because I think that there's a lesson with John Pilger's legacy, which is that often so-called campaigning or independent or freelance journalists, often, not always, um, in fact, I shouldn't even say often because that implies that it's a run-of-the-mill thing. Occasionally, occasionally you get freelance independents, campaigning journalists who actually end up serving as propagandists for their chosen ideology, and I think that's very much the case with John Pilger. So the Times obituary starts off with an anecdote which is kind of typical of Pilger's legacy, and this is quite low scale compared to some of the other things on his record. I'm not going to read out the whole thing for time reasons, and also just would be lazy on my part, um, just to read word for word, but I'm going to um, mention some of this because I think it really highlights his legacy. In 1982, the crusading journalist John Pilger wrote in the Daily Mirror about how in Bangkok he had purchased Suni, an 8-year-old illiterate village girl, for £85. Over 3 pages, Pilger declared that this slave, in inverted commas, was merely one of an estimated 200,000 children forced into hard labour in sweatshop factories or as domestics and prostitutes. It was a story that grabbed international attention, especially because it possessed a perfect ending. After heading back to what was described as a village in northeast Thailand, Pilger and his photographer miraculously discovered Suni's mother and photographed the tearful reunion, while a visibly moved Pilger looked on and pledged money for Suni's education. Unfortunately for Pilger, a follow-up by a more sceptical journalist, who isn't named here, um, discovered that Suni was actually attending primary school in Bangkok and that the entire story was fabricated by an enterprising taxi driver who had been hired by Pilger to find a genuine slave girl but had failed to do so. Instead, the driver bribed a mother and daughter living in Bangkok to play the part. When Oberon Moore commented on this in an article in The Spectator, Pilger sued them for questioning his story, and as a result, no London newspaper immediately followed up on the hoax. This prompted Waugh to pursue Pilger for the bias of his reporting and ultimately invent a new verb, to pilger, pilgerize, or to be pilgered. It was defined as to present information in a sensationalist manner to reach a foregone conclusion, using emotive language to make a false political point, treating a subject emotionally with generous disregard for inconvenient detail, or making a pompous judgment on wrong premises. That was pretty much the entire personality of Pilcher. You know, he was smart enough to be emotive, to capture audience's attention with that style of reporting. The problem is he did evade the truth. Now, this particular anecdote, I can allow for he was misled by a source. That sometimes happens, and even the most um, meticulous journalists can, fall victim to that where they're misled by someone. But the fact that not only did he admit that this story was, a sham, that he was misled, he actually sued London newspapers for trying to, follow up on it. And throughout his career, Pilger was extremely litigious. He would threaten legal action against anyone that questioned, Saint John Pilger. He was an incredibly self-righteous individual. Um, and it was actually withdrawn. That term to pilgerize was later withdrawn from the Oxford English Dictionary of New Words after legal action by Pilger. Now, like I say, I'm not going to go through the whole thing. Where he got prominent early attention was his reporting on the awful events in Cambodia in the 1970s. Um, and as this says, in 1979, Pilger was at the height of his fame with the broadcast of his ITV documentary Year Zero, The Silent Death of Cambodia, which showed the plight of that country. Now, I feel that the earlier parts of his career, Pilger probably did do some things to highlight issues like that. The problem with John Pilger was his entire career was through the spectrum of an anti-American, anti-West narrative bias. Even when he was reporting on the worst excesses of the genocide in Cambodia, he would never lay the blame at the Khmer Rouge themselves. No, it was the fault of the American bombing of Cambodia. It was the fault of the Americans. He claimed the Vietnamese liberated Cambodia, although that was a raw issue between the two countries for many years to come. Um, and he called Pol Pot an Asian Hitler, not an Asian Stalin, not an Asian Mao. Well, Mao was Asian, but using the fascist analogy rather than the fact that Pol Pot was aligned much more with communism. And that's typical again of Pilger. Um, Pretty much every problem that this man covered, he always put an anti-West angle on it. You know, Instead of blaming bin Laden for 9/11, he blamed American foreign policy. Instead of blaming Al Qaeda for the London bombings, he blamed British foreign policy. It was always, well, it's the fault of the West. Um, and, he had a long track record of praising dictators. Like I say, I'm doing this in a abridged form because it's quite a long obituary. But, people are free to access this, so um, I'm not embellishing anything on like John Pilger. Um, There was never a single example of Pilger praising a pro-Western leader or government. Instead, it was dictators such as Fidel Castro of Cuba, Hugo Chavez of Venezuela, Saddam Hussein of Iraq, and Putin of Russia, or the communist rulers of Vietnam that were sympathetically portrayed. When questioned about his left-wing bias, Pilger responded, "I stand by every word I've ever written. I can back everything up with facts. I've never made up the facts to fit an agenda," which is clearly a lie. Unlike the corporate media, my questions do not have a tone of voice. I simply call people to account with facts. Well, I'm going to go forward a little bit here with his attitude to the Salisbury poisoning in 2018. On the Russian poisoning in 2018 of Sergei and Yulia Skripal in Salisbury, Pilger asserted, "This is a carefully constructed drama as part of the propaganda campaign that has been building now for several years in order to justify the actions of NATO, Britain and the United States towards Russia." As usual, he added that's a fact. Now, he had no facts there. He had nothing to back that up. It was a conspiracy theory spouted out, the same sort of narrative that was spouted out by RT correspondents and others sympathetic to Putin. Frankly, I when I looked for this obituary, I wanted to be sort of generous and think, well, okay, maybe he was conscientious early on, and then he became more radicalized later on when he got more cozy with Russia Today and the Putin regime. But actually, it was throughout his career. And Pilger was a highly decorated journalist, highly travelled journalist. I mean, he won numerous awards, and he wrote for some high-profile publications in the UK, such as the Daily Mirror, and apparently he had an agreement that his copy wouldn't be touched, which caused resentment with colleagues. In other words, he could call the shots. So Pilger clearly he had enough skill and wit to have bargaining power as a journalist. A lot of journalists have to basically take what they're given and negotiate and work with the flow. So Pilger, I don't know whether it was from an overbearing personality. I don't know whether it was for his reputation of litigious action, but he managed to do that. Um, See, there was even Nelson Mandela. You'd think Nelson Mandela would be someone that Pilger would look up to, and he did initially. But then he even criticised Mandela for selling off bloated and inefficient state industries to the private sector. Such was his left-wing worldview. Um, in 2000, on a trip to Saddam Hussein's Iraq, Pilger claimed that I have seldom felt as safe as in any country. Well, before, this isn't a John Pilger thing, but before the rumble in the jungle in Kinshasa between Ali and Foreman in 1974, Kinshasa was described as the safest city on earth. But that, hid the fact that it was governed at that time by Mobutu Sese Seko, one of Africa's most brutal dictators. Saddam Hussein's severe human rights abuses are well documented. Now, whatever people think of the invasion of Iraq, I personally opposed it at the time. I still think it was a major mistake. But I find it rather sickening that someone like John Pilger, who pontificated about human rights and injustices, would go to a country like Iraq, where Saddam had committed genocide against the Kurds. And this was in 2000, after the fact. And basically praise that regime. It's sickening, absolutely sickening. That's why I call him a human rights hypocrite. He wasn't PC. A decade later, Pilger described President Obama, and I quote, as an Uncle Tom who surrounded himself with Zionists. Donald Trump, meanwhile, was said to be less dangerous than his rival Hillary Clinton. Trump is speaking straight to ordinary Americans. Well, Trump's a con man, and I think Pilger was as well. Even a week before the 2022 Russian invasion of Ukraine, Pilger, a regular guest on the propaganda TV channel Russia Today, Putin News I call it, dismissed such a possibility as Western propaganda to assist the neo-Nazi Ukrainian government. Instead, NATO itself is a real threat to European security. What's the best that can be said for John Pilger? I suppose you could argue that some of his reporting, simply by the fact he was a celebrity journalist, even though there was embellishment there, brought generic attention to some of the issues he covered, such as the Cambodian genocide, even though his narrative was skewed. I suppose you could give him that. He had a colourful life, very colourful life. He was well travelled. Doesn't say much about his personal relationships here, but that's not here or there. I think it would be a bit like being married to a soldier, that sort of journalist who's constantly travelling. That's not here or there. He was present at the assassination of Robert Kennedy. Um, the man had a colourful life. But, what I have a real problem with is with the likes of John Pilger is they're complete moral hypocrites. Someone like Pilger, who made a career out of pontificating and lecturing and talking about the evils of American capitalism and Western foreign policy, shamelessly served as a yes man for tyrant after tyrant, most recently Putin. And I think that's beneath contempt. That is not truth. That is not giving the facts as they are. That's simply dishonest. And I think he'd done it to mould into his anti-West, anti-American worldview. Put it this way, you get left-wing journalists at the BBC who wouldn't necessarily be pro-American, but I think Pilger was on a different level. He's not the only journalist to have this reputation. The late Robert Fisk, to a lesser extent. In fact, there was also an adjective coined for him, fisking, verb, I should say, to fisk. It wasn't quite as famous as Pilger, but a similar thing. Fisk too was accused of left-wing bias and turning a blind eye to some of the excesses, particularly in the Middle East. I want to be charitable and say that Pilger was an experienced journalist who brought attention to some of the world's great injustices. But unfortunately, I think this was a man whose legacy was so overshadowed by his smutty pandering to tyrants that to me really does overshadow everything else. Whatever good he may have done, it just overshadows everything else. In Italy, he once stole logs from a farmer, didn't pay the man. And I just mention this because it's an example of his arrogance, where he said apparently he had a translator say in Italian that he wasn't a thief. And in fact, let me quote this directly. Let's see. His sense of righteousness and humorlessness meant there were rarely apologies for questionable personal behaviour. On one occasion in the early 80s, Pilger stopped his car next to the adjoining Tuscan farmer's woodpile and helped himself to a number of freshly cut logs without any permission or compensation. The farmer's wife complained to a neighbour, prompting Pilger to ask a friend to write a letter in Italian asserting he was not a thief, though he made no effort to pay for the logs. Apparently he didn't thank the man either. And from that day onwards, the farmer and Pilger never spoke to each other again. And when he was talking about the excesses of the iniquities of the Thai military and Western capitalism in Thailand, he invariably said in the Mandarin Oriental, one of the grandest and most expensive hotels in Asia. I think there's something particularly odious, and you can find hypocrisies on the right as well, for sure. But there's something about, we've heard the term champagne socialist leveled at politicians. In the case of Pilger, he was described as, let me get this quote correctly, I think it was Bollinger Bolshevik, Bollinger Champagne, because often he lived it up himself whilst pontificating and pointing fingers at the West. I'd known the name John Pilger for years. I always knew he was on the left, but in recent years it's become more and more obvious that he was basically a stooge for Putin. And I really want to be charitable. I want to say he'd done some good stuff, but like I say, that legacy is just so overwhelming. And I think it's a very, very shameful legacy for a journalist to be a yes man for tyranny, which he was. Why? To suit his narrative. I mean, for him to talk about just presenting the facts when he basically was prepared to lie in order to suit his narrative, or even to present stories without giving any evidence for them and then say it was a fact, as was the Salisbury case. And this is a good example of a journalist allowing his or her personal worldview to cloud their judgment. Now, I would say the same about journalists who are excessively pro-West, who might be excessively favourable to the British or American or Israeli governments. The most important thing for a journalist is to tell the truth and not bring their own feelings into it. Pilger regularly did. Now, I'm under no illusions, and I've no doubt this video will be attacked, because someone like John Pilger, I would say, was a sort of a demagogue, in the sense that he used his significant fame and prestige to rile up sentiments against the West, whilst never blaming other actors involved. And, no doubt he will be held in high regard by a lot of people who share his anti-West worldview. I've no doubt about that. But the facts, and I mean the facts, speak for themselves. John Pilger was a propagandist for tyranny. Whatever good work he may have done, that overshadows his legacy. And I think that's why we need to treat freelance journalists who use narratives like mainstream media, and they're constantly attacking Western governments but have nothing to say about Russia or Iran or other players, need to be treated with great suspicion. Eva Bartlett was a recent example, Canadian national. She served as a propagandist for Assad. And I really have very little respect for these people, because they're propping up such regimes with their lies. And I think it's morally reprehensible. Anyway, I will round this up, but to me that is a legacy of John Pilger, and it's not a good one.